Nathan Reed knew this wouldn't be an easy fight. He had faced ruthless enemies on the battlefield. But taking down a corrupt officer, protected by the very institution, meant to hold him accountable. That was an entirely different war. He closed his laptop, his gaze shifting to an old photograph on the table, his mother smiling, warm and full of life. Her suffering wouldn't be in vain, and Victor Malone would soon understand that some men do not forgive. Victor Malone, Nathan murmured, his voice low and ice-cold. Your time has come, beyond the window. The first rays of sunlight broke through the thin curtains, but Nathan had no time to savor the morning's peace. The hunt had begun, and this time, the predator would become the prey. As the first rays of morning sunlight crept through the window, Nathan Reed had already finalized his plan for the battle ahead. After years of facing danger on brutal battlefields, he understood that this fight would be different, not against distant enemies in a foreign land, but against those who wielded the law as a weapon in the heart of Atlanta. Before stepping out of his room, he took one last glance at his mother's photograph and silently vowed, "Don't worry, Mum, they will pay for what they've done." Nathan left the small apartment and headed straight for Zone 3 Police Precinct, the den of Victor Malone and James Sullivan. The moment he stepped into the station's front lobby, the once busy atmosphere thickened instantly. Conversations quieted, heads turned, eyes filled with curiosity, skepticism, and restrained excitement, fixated on the unfamiliar man who had just entered. Nathan walked up to the front desk, his demeanor calm yet unwavering, his voice carrying through the station clear and firm. "I want to see Victor Malone." The receptionist flinched, eyes darting around nervously. But Nathan didn't need to repeat himself. Almost immediately, the door to the back office swung open, and Victor Malone emerged, a smug grin plastered across his face. He had been waiting for this moment, orchestrating it like a predator lying in wait. He moved with a slow, deliberate stride, exuding the confidence of a man who believed he was in control. "Specialist Reed, you finally made it," Malone taunted, his voice dripping with amusement as if they were old acquaintances. There was a glint of satisfaction in Malone's eyes as he stopped a few steps away, arms crossed over his chest, in a stance of arrogance and provocation. Nathan locked eyes with him and instantly knew Malone had done his homework. He didn't just know Nathan's name or face. He knew his history, his career, and, most importantly, what had happened to Clara. "I have to admit, your military record is impressive," Malone continued, his words laced with mockery. "Silver Star. That rescue mission in Syria. A real war hero. Huh. Too bad this isn't the Middle East. This is Atlanta." Nathan understood immediately. Malone had been digging into his past for some time. The way he mentioned the rescue mission, emphasizing it with a sneer, confirmed that Malone wasn't just aware of Nathan's achievements. He intended to weaponize them. But what unsettled Nathan wasn't the mockery. It was the absolute confidence in Malone's eyes, the certainty of a man who had already calculated every move Nathan would make. This wasn't a confrontation Malone feared. It was one he had prepared for. Malone smirked again, his voice dripping with disdain. "I heard your mother needed money for surgery. Right, $4.20 so, wasn't it? She must be so proud, knowing her son is dumb enough to walk into a police station demanding it back." Nathan forced himself to remain still, his muscles coiled tight beneath his skin. Malone's words were a deliberate poison, his tone dripping with contempt for Clara, designed to provoke Nathan into a reckless reaction. But Nathan refused to give Malone what he wanted. He clenched his fists slightly, keeping his voice even as he replied, "I'm not here for your insults. Give my mother back what you stole, or the consequences will be severe." Malone threw his head back and laughed, loud and exaggerated, making sure the entire station heard. His gaze flickered toward his fellow officers, as if reinforcing his dominance in the room. "You hear that? This guy thinks he makes the rules. Maybe the military spoiled you too much, huh, Reed? Now you think you can bring your battlefield justice into my station." The officers around them murmured, some throwing suspicious glances at Nathan. Malone had wasted no time twisting the narrative, turning public perception in his favor. He took a step closer, lowering his voice just enough for Nathan to hear, though his words were still loud enough to carry to those nearby. "Listen closely. Reed, I know exactly what kind of man you are. A worthless black soldier who got a free pass because of some diversity quota. You think just because you carried a rifle in the Middle East, you can come back here and tell us how to do our jobs. This is Atlanta, and we are the law. Malone had been setting this trap from the moment Nathan walked through the doors. This wasn't just an attempt to intimidate him. It was a carefully calculated move to destroy him in the worst possible way. He didn't just want Nathan to lose control. He wanted to turn him into a symbol of everything society already feared, a violent black man, a thug who attacked the police, a justification for the very prejudices that men like Malone thrived on. For him, this wasn't just about getting rid of Nathan. It was about proving his warped beliefs about power and order. If Nathan snapped and struck first, Malone would have all the justification he needed to order an immediate arrest. A Green Beret assaulting an officer right in the middle of Zone 3 police precinct. The headlines would write themselves. The narrative would be twisted and spread like wildfire, painting Nathan as a criminal in the public eye. Malone knew that image was everything. He had seen it happen before, black men lured into confrontations with the police, only to have the media reduce them to troublemakers, threats to public safety. A carefully edited video clip showing nothing but Nathan throwing a punch, without any of the context leading up to it, would be enough to ignite public outrage in exactly the direction Malone wanted. And Malone hadn't chosen this battleground by accident. He wanted an audience, his fellow officers, the ones who had spent years covering for each other, men who would have no problem writing a false report if it meant protecting one of their own. If Nathan got arrested, they would testify that he had been the aggressor, that he had threatened law enforcement. Malone even had a backup plan in case things escalated too far. He could always claim self-defense. After all, he was dealing with a trained soldier, a Green Beret, skilled in combat. That label would be twisted against Nathan, turning him into a dangerous, uncontrollable weapon rather than a man seeking justice. But above all, Malone wanted to make this personal. He wanted to send a message, not just to Nathan, but to the entire black community. No matter how hard they worked, no matter how much they achieved, no matter if they became soldiers or heroes, men like him would always be in control. This wasn't just about physically beating Nathan. It was about crushing his very image in the public eye. Malone wanted Nathan to become living proof of his own hateful ideology, that black men couldn't control their anger, that they would always turn to violence, that they were never victims, only perpetrators. Nathan stared into Malone's eyes, seeing through every inch of the trap he had laid out. He could feel the weight of the gazes around him, watching his every move, waiting for him to slip. If he so much as raised a hand, it would all be over. His mother's suffering would be lost in the noise, and he would become exactly what Malone wanted him to be. From deep within, Nathan knew that to win this fight for justice, he couldn't fall into Malone's trap so easily. Nathan stepped out of Zone 3 police precinct, his hands clenched tightly at his sides. The rage still burned within him, but he knew he couldn't let it take control. Malone had set a trap, carefully orchestrating a scenario that would back Nathan into a corner with no way out. But Nathan wasn't the kind of man to fall into a trap so easily. He had fought on battlefields where a single misstep could mean the death of an entire team. He understood the importance of patience. Darkness had begun swallowing the streets of Atlanta as he walked, his mind running through every possible move. He needed a plan. He needed information. He needed a way to strike at the very system Maloney relied on for protection. At that moment, a black car pulled up beside him. The window rolled down, and a low voice spoke. "Get in. Read." Nathan glanced inside. It was Lieutenant Thomas Hayes, but unlike the others in that precinct, Hayes was one of the few who still had integrity in this rotten system. Nathan had heard of him, even back in the military, a man who hadn't been corrupted, someone trying to change things from the inside despite knowing he was fighting in a swamp of filth. Nathan hesitated for only a moment before opening the door and stepping in. Hayes didn't speak immediately. He drove through the quiet streets, the glow of streetlights casting blurred streaks of gold against the windows. Only when they reached an empty parking lot did he stop the car, kill the engine, and turn to face Nathan. "I know what happened to your mother," Hayes began, his voice heavy with the weight of knowledge. "And I know you're not the kind of man to sit back and let it go." Nathan leaned back in his seat, arms crossed over his chest. "Good." Then cut to the chase. "Hayes, what do you want?" Hayes exhaled. his expression a mix of caution and sincerity. "I want you to stay smart." He paused before continuing. "I know Malone and Sullivan are scum, but they aren't just rogue cops. They have an entire system protecting them. If you want to win, you have to fight on your own terms." Nathan narrowed his eyes. "A system?" Hayes nodded. "Malone isn't just some dirty cop. He's connected to people with real power, the ones who've been covering for him all these years. He's not just a thug who robbed an old woman on the street. He's part of something much bigger." Nathan remained silent, letting the pieces fall into place in his mind. Hayes leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "There's something else. Malone isn't planning to let you take this any further. He knows you won't stop, so he's hiring people to take you out before you get the chance." Nathan wasn't surprised. He had seen this kind of play before. Back in the war, men like Malone never fought head-on when they could strike from the shadows. But one detail stood out: hiring people. Who? Hayes gripped the steering wheel a little tighter. "A team of professionals, not street-level enforcers. Malone knows who you are, knows how you've been trained, so he's not sending amateurs. He wants you gone cleanly. An accident, a misunderstanding, or just a body no one will investigate." Nathan clenched his jaw but remained composed. "Good. That means he's afraid." Hayes stared at him. "Don't you get it? Reed, this isn't just about getting your mother's money back anymore. This is a war." Nathan took a slow breath, his eyes drifting to the streets of Atlanta beyond the windshield. Hayes was right. This was no longer just about justice. It was about taking on a system that would kill to keep its power intact. Nathan turned back to Hayes, his gaze resolute. "You're right. I can't play by Malone's rules, because his rules are designed to twist the truth. But if he thinks I'm going to let him walk away from this, he's dead wrong." Hayes studied him for a long moment before letting out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head. "You're exactly like they say. You don't back down. And I'm not fighting alone." Hayes raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Nathan didn't answer right away. Instead, he opened the door, stepping out onto the pavement. He looked back at Hayes one last time. "Malone thinks he's the hunter, but I'm about to show him who the real predator is." Then he shut the door and walked away into the night. Hayes watched him go, a chill creeping down his spine. The war had only just begun. Atlanta at night lay cloaked in silence. But beneath that deceptive calm, a war was about to erupt. Malone was done waiting. He knew Nathan Reed was dangerous, not just because of his military training, but because of his relentless refusal to back down. He needed to deal with this problem quickly, decisively, before Nathan had the chance to strike back. Malone didn't trust street thugs or low-level enforcers. He needed professionals, men who knew how to make problems disappear without leaving a trace. And he had called the right people. 5 men sat inside an unmarked black SUV, parked just one street away from Nathan's apartment. They didn't talk much, just checked their weapons, exchanged nods, and waited for the signal. This wasn't their first job. Accidents dot disappearances. Bodies never found. This was routine work for them. The leader, known only as Vance, was an ex-mercenary, a man who had once operated in the Middle East before returning to the US to do cleanup work for those with power. He lifted his radio, his voice a low growl. "The target's a special forces operative. Not easy, but not impossible. Quick, clean, leave no traces." The other 4 nodded and moved out, spreading through the neighborhood to surround Nathan's apartment. But just as they entered the block, the entire street went dark. Every light vanished, the street lamps, the windows, even the neon glow of nearby signs all snuffed out in an instant. The alleyways became voids of pure blackness. Inside the SUV, Vance stiffened, eyes scanning the street. What the hell? They had scouted this area before the job. There were no signs of electrical malfunctions. This wasn't an accident. This was a signal, a warning. A shadow flickered past them, too fast to track, and then a scream. Vance spun around, but one of his men had already vanished into the darkness. No struggle, no gunfire. 1 second he was there. The next he was gone. The remaining men felt a chill creep down their spines. "He's hunting us," one of them whispered, gripping his gun tighter, his hands trembling despite himself. Vance's voice dropped to a harsh whisper. "Spread out. Don't let him box us in." But before they could react, another scream cut through the silence. Another man gone. No sign of Nathan. No sound of a fight, only the overwhelming presence of something unseen, something lurking in the darkness. These men were used to being the predators, but tonight, they weren't the hunters, they were the hunted, the suffocating blackness, the absolute silence, the knowledge that someone was watching them from every shadow it gnawed at their nerves. Shoot, just shoot. One of them screamed, losing all control. Gunfire erupted, deafening in the empty streets. But they weren't shooting at an enemy. They were firing blindly into the void, at the fear tightening around their throats. Vance gritted his teeth, his instincts screaming at him. He had made a grave mistake. This wasn't an assassination. It was urban guerrilla warfare. Nathan wasn't running. He was using the city itself as his battleground, isolating them, picking them off one by one. Vance grabbed his radio, desperation creeping into his voice as he reached out to Malone, who was monitoring from a nearby safe house. "We've got a problem. This guy isn't running. He's hunting us." For the first time, Malone's voice came back with a hint of genuine fear. "What do you mean?" "I mean, if you thought he'd run like a scared little, you were dead wrong. He's turned this whole block into a goddamn war zone. I've lost 2 men, and we haven't even seen his face." Malone clenched his jaw, fingers tightening around his phone. The plan was unraveling. Nathan wasn't just resisting. He was controlling the battlefield. Vance panted, his back pressed against an old brick wall, his eyes darting through the shadows. The darkness was too deep. The silence was too thick. Only his own ragged breathing filled the empty space around him. Then a whisper, ice cold, right at his ear. "You hear that?" Before he could turn, an iron grip locked around his throat and dragged him into the abyss. The streetlights flickered back to life 5 minutes later. The few survivors, barely a handful, stood shaking in the middle of the street, weapons scattered uselessly at their feet. Some had been bound to lampposts, their mouths stuffed with rags, eyes wide in terror. Vance lay sprawled on the pavement, unconscious, his face swollen from a single crushing blow, and on the brick wall opposite, written in the blood of one of the mercenaries, was a single sentence, "I know who sent you." When Malone received the call, his hands shook. For the first time in his life, he understood what it felt like to be prey. The night wind slithered through Atlanta's narrow alleyways, carrying the damp scent of aged brick and decay. Malone stood rigid, his grip tightening around his Glock, his frantic eyes scanning every shadow. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the harsh rhythm of his own breathing. The assassins he had hired were gone. No traces, no cries for help, not even bodies. They had simply disappeared. Malone had never felt this kind of powerlessness before. He had always been in control, a cop with untouchable authority, shielded by the system that ensured he faced no consequences. He was used to people bowing their heads, cowering before him. But this time, something had changed. A cold chill crawled up his spine as the realization settled in. He was no longer the hunter. He was the prey. Snatching his radio, he forced his voice to stay steady. "Vance, does anyone copy? Report now." Nothing but static. His pulse pounded as he spun on his heel, sprinting toward his patrol car. He had to get out, call for backup, regain control of the situation. But the moment he reached for the door, bang, the car door was ripped from its hinges, as if a hurricane had torn through it. Malone stumbled back, nearly falling to the ground, his eyes wide with shock. A figure stepped into the dim flicker of the streetlight. Nathan Reed emerged from the darkness, his face illuminated in cold, flickering light. No rage, no haste, just absolute control, like a predator savoring the final moments before the kill. "You like hunting people, don't you, Malone?" Nathan's voice was low, sharp, dot slicing through the air like a blade. Malone swallowed hard, his shaking hands lifting the gun, aiming straight at Nathan. "Back off. You have no right to do this." Nathan took a slow step forward, unfazed. "I think you're the one with no right," Malone roared, pulling the trigger. Bang! The bullet whizzed through the air, but Nathan was gone. Silence. Malone spun around wildly, his breath ragged, his eyes darting to every shadow. No one could move that fast. No one could. "You missed." The whisper came from right behind him. Before Malone could turn, a fist like a sledgehammer slammed into his ribs. He cried out, staggering back, barely able to keep himself upright. The pain shot through his body like fire. But there was no time to recover before a second blow struck his jaw, whipping his head back into the patrol car. Stars exploded in his vision as he gasped for air, sweat mixing with the cold terror sinking into his bones. He fumbled to raise the gun again, but a hand shot out. Vice-like fingers locked around his wrist and twisted. Snap! Malone howled in agony as his wrist wrenched at an unnatural angle. The gun tumbled from his grip, clattering onto the pavement. Before he could scream for help, a crushing force slammed him against the hood of his own car, pinned, defenseless, overpowered. Nathan leaned in, his voice quiet but each word laced with lethal intent. "How many people have you done this to?" Malone thrashed weakly, but Nathan tightened his grip, and for the first time in his life, he felt his own spine creak under the pressure. "You really thought you'd never pay for it?" Malone wheezed, panic clawing at his throat. This was fear, the real kind. Nathan reached inside his jacket. A flash of steel caught the dim streetlight as he pulled out a knife. The blade gleamed, wickedly sharp, its cold surface reflecting Malone's trembling face. The edge barely brushed his throat, not cutting, just a whisper of steel against skin. "What do you think I'm going to do next?" Malone swallowed hard, his lips trembling. "Please," he choked, his voice breaking. Nathan tilted his head slightly, as if considering the plea. Then, in an instant, he pulled back. Malone gasped for breath, his lungs heaving as he blinked up in dazed confusion. Nathan bent down, picked up the fallen gun, ejected the magazine, and tossed both into the storm drain nearby. His gaze was cold, delivering a message clearer than any threat. "I'm not you, Malone." Malone stared as Nathan turned and walked away, his figure melting into the night. For the first time in his life, Malone knew every time he stepped into a dark alley, every time he heard a sound in the dead of night, every time he felt eyes watching him from the shadows, he would remember the name Nathan Reed. Malone slumped onto the freezing pavement, his back pressed against the dented patrol car. His breath came in ragged, uneven gasps, his chest rising and falling like a drowning man who had barely managed to claw his way to the surface. But even though he had escaped Nathan's fists, he knew the nightmare wasn't over. The pain from the blows still pulsed through his ribs. But what truly made him tremble was Nathan's eyes, a gaze that needed no threats, no shouting, yet carved an irreversible fear into his mind. Nathan stood a few feet away, composed, unshaken by everything that had just happened. No explosive rage, no finishing blow, just a predator who knew his prey had already been conquered. Malone swallowed hard, trying to steady himself. But when Nathan calmly pulled his phone from his pocket, he realized it wasn't over. "You think this is finished?" "Malone." Nathan's voice was steady, but it carried the weight of a sentence already passed. Malone didn't answer. What could he even say? "I don't need to kill you," Nathan continued, stepping closer. "I don't need to dirty my hands with a piece of like you. I just need the world to see you for what you really are." He activated the camera, angling it toward Malone. "So now, start talking." Malone squinted, his breath hitching for a second before defiance flared in his eyes. "You're insane if you think I'll just destroy myself over some video," he spat out, forcing a hollow chuckle, grasping at the remnants of his confidence. But in an instant, Nathan crouched, his hand latching onto Malone's throat, not hard enough to knock him out, but just enough to remind him of the razor-thin line between life and death. "Do you think I ask twice?" Malone's eyes bulged. He could feel Nathan's fingers pressing into his skin, each second tightening the noose around his windpipe. The fear that surged through him was suffocating. But it wasn't the pressure of Nathan's grip that was the worst. It was his eyes. This was a man who knew exactly what he was capable of. And, if it came down to it, he wouldn't hesitate. Malone thrashed weakly, but it was useless. His throat locked up. His vision swam as oxygen slipped away. Nathan's grip didn't waver, not even slightly. "You wanted to play power games?" "Malone." "Fine." Nathan lifted the phone higher, his voice unshaken. "What do you think happens if I upload this video?" Malone clenched his teeth, still resisting. But after just 3 more seconds, the realization crashed over him. This wasn't a bluff. It could all end right here. A sharp strike to his collarbone forced a desperate, shuddering breath from his lungs. Nathan leaned in, his voice now a whisper that cut deeper than any scream. There won't be anywhere left for you. The police. They'll throw you under the bus to protect themselves. The criminals. They'll use you to burn down the whole department. And you think you can run. Trust me, Malone, if I want to make you disappear, no one will ever find your body. Malone's mouth opened, but no words came. Look around, Nathan continued, his eyes sweeping the empty street. There's no one coming to help you. And believe me, I don't bluff. He loosened his grip just enough for Malone to collapse into a coughing fit, his lungs clawing for air like he had been dragged out of the abyss. You have two choices, Malone, Nathan said. One, confess right now in front of the camera. Or two, I tell this story my way. And trust me, you won't like how it ends. Malone trembled, staring into the phone's lens. He knew he had lost. He knew there was no way out. His hands shook as he swallowed hard and finally began to speak. My name is Victor Malone. I am an officer of the Atlanta Police Department, Zone 3. Nathan said nothing, just kept the camera steady, watching. I have abused my power. Malone's voice cracked. I stole money from an innocent woman. I fabricated charges to cover up my crimes. Every word felt like a knife slicing through his own throat, but he knew if he didn't say them, he wouldn't exist much longer. I also hired hitmen to kill Nathan Reed. Nathan tilted his head slightly, the ghost of a cold smile playing at the corner of his lips. Keep going, Malone. Malone clenched his jaw, closing his eyes like he was driving a blade into his own chest. I have used my badge to harm and destroy the lives of people. I looked down on, his fists clenched tightly. I didn't do it just for the money. I did it because I believe people like them don't deserve the same rights as me. The moment. Malone's confession was forced into the light. Atlanta ignited. The videos, the evidence, and the internal documents detailing his crimes flooded the internet, spreading at a relentless pace. Footage of Malone brazenly robbing Clara Reed, audio recordings of him admitting to orchestrating harassment and violence against black citizens, and leaked reports showing how his investigations had always been swept under the rug. All of it was now public knowledge. The system that had shielded him for so long suddenly had no one left willing to protect him. Malone became the face of corruption in the Atlanta Police Department. Reporters swarmed Zone 3 precinct, hounding his superiors for answers, forcing them to address the scandal. But worse than the media storm was the silent betrayal of his fellow officers. No one wanted to be associated with the man now branded as the city's disgrace. Malone spiraled into panic. His power was gone, his safety net gone, his name had become toxic, a stain on the department that everyone wanted to scrub away. He had once believed himself untouchable, a man above consequence. Now, he was nothing but a discarded pawn, abandoned the moment he became a liability. He knew that if he stayed, the walls would close in, the investigations would come, the charges would stack up, and prison, the one place men like him never wanted to end up, would be inevitable. With no options left, Malone resigned that very night. He didn't wait for termination. He didn't wait for a subpoena. He quietly packed his belongings and walked out of the precinct, his steps heavy under the weight of every stare that followed him. No one spoke to him. No one said goodbye. He wasn't a police officer anymore, just another man running from his sins. He drove out of Atlanta under the cover of darkness. No destination, no plan, just the desperate need to be anywhere but here, before the walls caved in completely. But deep down, Malone knew there was nowhere left for him to run. In a quiet corner of the city, Nathan sat on the old wooden porch of his mother's house. He wasn't surprised to see the news. Malone's resigning and fleeing had always been the inevitable outcome. Once the city turned against him, there had never been another path. But this wasn't the end of the fight. Malone had been a symptom, not the disease. The system had protected him, nurtured him, enabled him to thrive for years. Atlanta could breathe a little easier with him gone. But if men like him still existed, still believed they could do the same without consequence, the cycle would never break. As the TV flickered with news segments dissecting Malone's downfall across the city, James Sullivan sat in his dimly lit apartment, an empty liquor bottle rolling across the table. The collapse of the man who had once seemed untouchable was all over the news, every channel, every article. Malone, once arrogant, once untouchable, now nothing but a disgraced name, spoken with disgust. Malone had run, A part of Sullivan knew that was the only thing he could do, but another part of him, the part that made him break out in a cold sweat every night, knew something far worse. Malone wasn't there to protect him anymore. Sullivan had never been strong. He had never been the one to stand at the front of a fight. He had been a scavenger, circling behind predators, feeding off their leftovers. When Malone had yanked the envelope of cash from Clara Reed's hands, Sullivan had said nothing. When Malone shoved her to the ground, he had only watched. He had never committed the crime, but he had let it happen. And now he was realizing that silence had made him just as guilty. His phone vibrated a number he didn't recognize. He didn't answer. The nightmare of that night still haunted him, the way Nathan Reed had walked into Zone 3. His presence alone enough to turn the unshakable Malone into a broken man, the way he had unraveled everything, taken apart what should have been unbreakable. He remembered the call from Malone that night. His voice frantic, panicked, like a trapped animal realizing there was no way out. Sullivan swallowed hard. Nathan hadn't killed Malone, but that didn't mean Nathan would spare him. He shot up from his chair, moving to the window, peeling back the curtain just enough to glimpse the street below. The city moved as usual. Cars passed, streetlights flickered. Nothing seemed out of place, but he couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere out there in the shadows, someone was watching. It had been 3 days since Malone vanished, and Sullivan had never felt more on edge. At the precinct, no one spoke to him the way they used to. Colleagues who once exchanged nods of acknowledgement now avoided his gaze, as if he carried a curse. The unspoken respect, the silent approval he had once relied on gone. Now, every time he entered a room, conversations died. He was no longer the hunter. He was the prey. The thought of running had crossed his mind more than once. He could pack up, leave Atlanta, start fresh, somewhere else. But one thing stopped him. Malone had run, and no one knew where he was. No one knew if he was even alive. Sullivan refused to become the next Malone. Instead, he chose to live in the shadows of his own fear. He called in sick, refusing to step foot in the station. He locked his doors, avoided all contact, distanced himself from anything that could pull him back into the spiral that had consumed Malone. But fear wasn't something that could be locked away behind 4 walls. It seeped into his mind, waking him in the middle of the night, his back drenched in cold sweat. He dreamed of being dragged into a dark alley, unseen hands tightening around his throat, and when he looked up, Nathan Reed was there, not with rage, not with hatred, just the silent, unshakable stare of a man who could not be stopped. He began avoiding the streets he once patrolled. He switched grocery stores, found new bars, changed his routines. But still, no matter how much he tried to escape the feeling, he knew one day Nathan would come for him. Time passed, and to the world, things seemed to settle. But for Sullivan, peace would never return. No one knocked on his door. No threatening calls came. No one followed him, at least not in a way he could prove. But he knew Nathan was still out there, watching, waiting. And if Sullivan ever made a wrong move, took one misstep back into his old ways, he would return. The news of Malone's downfall and his mysterious disappearance spread like wildfire through Zone 3 and across Atlanta. The officers who had once thrived under the same corrupt system now found themselves holding their breath. No one knew where Malone had gone. No one knew if he was even alive. And that uncertainty terrified them more than any trial or indictment ever could. On a cold, grey morning, as the officers of Zone 3 arrived for work as usual, an unmarked brown envelope sat on the captain's desk. No one saw who had placed it there. No one knew where it had come from. Inside, a single sheet of paper. If you keep doing what Malone did, I will come back. No fingerprints, no evidence. But the message was louder than anything else. For years, Zone 3 had operated under the assumption that there were no consequences, that officers like Malone and Sullivan could do as they pleased, shielded by the system that had always protected them. But now, for the first time, the untouchables knew fear. The atmosphere in the station grew tense, heavy with a weight they had never felt before. The officers who once laughed at victims like Clara Reed no longer found humor in their cruelty. No one dared to speak of Malone, but his name hung in the air like a warning. No one wanted to be the next to disappear into the night. Lieutenant Thomas Hayes watched in silence. He didn't know if Nathan had left the note himself, but he understood one thing. whether the message had been delivered in words or in fear. Its meaning had taken root. Those who abuse their power would now think twice before laying a hand on the innocent. Hayes picked up the note, reading it again, his expression unreadable. This wasn't justice in the traditional sense, but in a city where the system was still riddled with rot. Sometimes justice needed a steel hand to clear the way before anything new could be built. In a narrow alleyway, a few blocks away, a group of officers, ones familiar with dirty work, gathered in hushed voices, their fear visible in their eyes. One of them, Morales, slammed his fist onto the table, his voice tense with frustration. What the hell are we supposed to do? Malone is gone. Sullivan is hiding like a rat in the sewers. I'm not about to end up like them. Another officer, Foster, growled. Calm down. This could just be some scare tactic. We don't know for sure that Nathan Reed is behind all of this. Morales let out a bitter laugh. You actually believe that? Who the hell else could have done this? Everyone in this department knew what Malone was up to, but only he was targeted, and those hitmen Malone hired, they didn't just disappear by accident. The air in the room grew suffocating. No one wanted to admit what they were all thinking. Nathan Reed wasn't someone they could handle. He wasn't some street thug they could beat down and bury under fabricated charges. He was a soldier, a man who had fought in real wars. And more importantly, he wasn't reckless. He chose his targets. Foster swallowed hard and spoke slowly. We have only one option. Lay low. Keep our heads down. No trouble. Nothing that puts us on his radar. Morales clenched his fists, his pride seething. But he knew there was no alternative. They couldn't win against someone like Nathan. He didn't play by their rules. And that made him more dangerous than any enemy they had ever faced. For the first time, they understood. They were no longer the ones in control. Meanwhile, Nathan Reed stood on the rooftop of an old building, silently watching the city stretch out before him. The streetlights flickered below, the roads still bustling as if nothing had changed. But he knew better. Something had shifted. Malone was gone. Sullivan was too scared to show his face. And the rest of them, though not entirely crushed, were forced to hesitate. Even if he returned to the military, they would always be looking over their shoulders. Atlanta had changed. The night was unnaturally quiet, no wailing sirens, no drunken laughter from men who believed they were untouchable. The city continued to move. The world kept turning, but the shadows that had once loomed over certain streets had begun to thin. Nathan Reed stepped through the creaking wooden door of the house he grew up in, the sound of its hinges echoing softly in the stillness of the night. The warm scent of cinnamon and herbal tea drifted from the small kitchen, wrapping the air in a comforting familiarity he hadn't felt in years. Clara Reed sat at the table, her frail hands resting lightly on the worn wooden surface. Her eyes never left her son. Nathan placed an envelope in front of her. No words were needed, no explanations. The weight of it spoke for itself. The money she had lost, every last dollar, had been returned. Clara stared at the envelope, then looked up at her son. Her expression held not just surprise, but something deeper, understanding, concern, a mother's quiet wisdom that came from witnessing too much of the world's cruelty. Her voice was soft but firm. What did you do to get this back? Nathan didn't answer right away. He looked at his mother, the woman who had worked herself to the bone to raise him, the woman who had never once bowed to hardship. He knew she wasn't naive. She wasn't the type to accept pretty lies. But there were some truths better left unknown. He smiled, small but genuine. You don't want to know, Clara exhaled, not pressing further. She already knew the answer in the way only a mother could. There was relief in her eyes, but also worry and unspoken acceptance that justice didn't always come from courtrooms or badges, but from those willing to do what was necessary. Nathan sat across from her, his hands clasped together. They said nothing more. They didn't need to. The silence between them wasn't heavy. It was the silence of understanding. Clara's surgery went ahead, as scheduled. Nathan spent hours in the hospital hallway, elbows on his knees, eyes locked onto the glowing light above the operating room doors. He had never been the kind of man to believe in fate or gods, but this time he found himself praying something he hadn't done since he was a child. Finally, the doctor stepped out, pulling down his mask, a reassuring smile on his face. The surgery had been a success. Nathan closed his eyes. For the first time in weeks, he allowed himself to relax, Just a little, not because men like Malone had disappeared, not because he had sent a message to Zone 3, but because the one person in the world who could still make him feel like a child, his mother, was going to live. He stepped into the hospital room where Clara lay, her eyes still heavy with exhaustion, but her lips curled into a soft smile the moment she saw him. Nathan sat down beside her, gently taking her hand in his. "I'm here." Clara didn't say a word. She simply squeezed his hand, her way of telling him she knew that she didn't need to worry anymore. In the weeks that followed, life slowly settled into a new rhythm, one that wasn't entirely the same as before, but one that Nathan could accept. He stayed by his mother's side, helping her recover, taking slow walks with her through their quiet little neighborhood, which now felt just a bit more peaceful than before. He knew that men like Malone would eventually be replaced by others, that the world would never truly be rid of those who abused their power. But he also knew that sometimes, even the smallest action could tip the scales. Rumors of Malone's downfall and the mysterious warning letter continued to spread. No one could say for certain that Nathan was behind it all, but everyone understood. Things had changed. The old order had been broken. The officers who once laughed as they bent the law to their will were no longer so bold, and Atlanta, while still far from perfect, had shifted, if only a little. One quiet evening, Nathan sat on the porch, watching the street in front of him. Clara walked out with 2 cups of herbal tea, setting one in front of him before settling into the chair beside him. "Do you think they'll come back?" Nathan took a sip of his tea, letting the warmth spread through him. He looked at his mother, then back at the street, at the golden glow spilling from small windows, at the people who could now go about their lives without bowing their heads to men like Malone. He smiled faintly, setting his cup down. "No, they know better now." Clara nodded, satisfied with his answer. She didn't know exactly what Nathan had done, but she knew one thing: he was still here. And for her, that was enough. Nathan Reed's story wasn't just about reclaiming justice for his mother. It was a warning to those who thrived on unchecked power. A man who once only sought to protect his family had become the nightmare of those who believed they were untouchable. The fall of Malone and the ghost that now haunted Sullivan had changed Atlanta in ways no one could have predicted. But the real question remained: had justice truly been restored? Or would others rise to take Malone's place, continuing the cycle of corruption? What do you think Nathan should do next? Share your thoughts in the comments. If you found this story meaningful, hit like to spread the message. Share so more people can hear it. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories of justice. Thank you for watching. See you in the next video.